Two B-17 bombers. 20,000 feet in the air. They collide mid-flight during World War II. But here's where physics just gave up. Instead of both planes exploding into a fireball, they got stuck together. Fused. Like some twisted metal Frankenstein. And then this is the insane part: one pilot kept flying both planes for 30 miles as one aircraft. Sounds impossible? That's because it should be. Let me explain now, before we get into the absolute chaos of what happened on December 31, 1944, you need to understand something about the B-17 Flying Fortress. This wasn't just any airplane. This was a 30-ton beast of American engineering. 4 engines. 13 machine guns. A wingspan of over 100 feet. They called it the Flying Fortress for a reason. This thing was built like a tank that somehow learned to fly. The B-17 was the backbone of America's strategic bombing campaign in Europe. Every single day, hundreds of these bombers would take off from bases in England, fly across the English Channel, and drop bombs on Nazi Germany. Factories. Rail yards. Oil refineries. Military installations. The goal was simple: destroy Germany's ability to wage war. But here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Flying a B-17 was basically signing up for a coin flip with death. The average lifespan of a bomber crew in 1944 was about 15 missions. You needed to complete 25 missions to go home. Do the math. The odds were not in your favor. Every mission was a nightmare. You're flying at 25,000 feet, where the temperature drops to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Your oxygen mask freezes to your face. Your fingers go numb even through heated gloves. And that's before the enemy even shows up. Then come the German fighters. Messerschmitts. Focke-Wulfs. Coming at you from every direction at 400 miles per hour. Your gunners are spinning their turrets, trying to track targets that appear and disappear in seconds. The noise is deafening. The vibration shakes your teeth loose, and if the fighters don't get you, the flak will. Anti-aircraft fire from the ground. Thousands of shells exploding around you, filling the sky with black smoke and shrapnel. You can't dodge it. You can't outrun it. You just fly straight and pray. So when I tell you that 2 B-17s collided at 20,000 feet and somehow stayed in the air, you need to understand the context. These men were already living on borrowed time. What happened next was just the universe deciding to get creative. Let me set the scene. December 31st, 1944. New Year's Eve. While people back home in America were preparing for parties and celebrations, the men of the 305th Bomb Group were preparing for a mission. Target: Hamburg, Germany. One of the most heavily defended cities in the WWII, the 305th Bomb Group was based at Chelveston, England. A small airfield about 80 miles north of London. The base was cold, muddy, and miserable. The barracks were drafty. The food was terrible. But these men didn't join the Army Air Forces for the accommodations. They joined to fight that morning. The crews woke up before dawn. They ate powdered eggs and toast. They attended a briefing, where the mission was outlined. When Hamburg was announced as the target, there was a collective groan. Hamburg was bad. Really bad. The flak over Hamburg was legendary. Hundreds of anti-aircraft guns are protecting the city's port and industrial facilities, but orders were orders. The crew suited up. Flight suits. Heated suits. Mae West life vests. Parachutes. Flak jackets. Oxygen masks. By the time you were fully dressed, you could barely move. Now, let me introduce you to the two crews that would become forever linked in aviation history. First, we have the crew of a B-17G nicknamed Lazy Daisy. The pilot was Second Lieutenant Glenn Rojon. 22 years old. From Michigan. Rojon had a reputation for being calm under pressure. Nothing rattled him. His co-pilot was Second Lieutenant William Leake. The navigator was Lieutenant Robert Washington. The bombardier was Lieutenant Edward Neuhaus. In the back of the plane were the enlisted men, the flight engineer, radio operator, ball turret gunner, waist gunners, and tail gunner. 10 men total, like every B-17 crew. Then we have the crew of another B-17G. This one didn't have a nickname that survived in historical records. The pilot was Second Lieutenant William McNabb. His crew was also 10 men. Young, scared, determined. Just like Rojon's crew, these two planes took off that morning as part of a massive formation. Over 1,000 bombers are heading to Germany. The sky was filled with aircraft. B-17s, B-24 Liberators, P-51 Mustang escorts. The largest air force the world had ever seen. The formation climbed to altitude 20,000 feet. Then 25,000 feet. The temperature dropped. Condensation trails stretched behind each bomber, painting white lines across the blue sky. From the ground, it must have looked almost beautiful. But inside those planes, there was nothing beautiful about it. The flight to Hamburg took hours. Hours of cold. Hours of tension. Hours of checking and rechecking equipment. The gunners test-fired their weapons. The navigator constantly updated their position. The pilots made tiny adjustments to stay in formation. And then they reached the target. The flak started before they could even see Hamburg. Black puffs of smoke appeared all around them. The bombers bounced and shook as shells exploded nearby. Some planes took hits. Some started trailing smoke. Some fell out of formation, spiraling toward the earth below. Rojon kept lazy-daisy steady. His job was to fly straight and level during the bomb run. No evasive action. No deviations. The bombardier needed a stable platform to aim. So Rojon flew through the flak, ignoring every instinct that screamed at him to turn away. The bombs dropped. Hundreds of tons of explosives are falling toward Hamburg. Then the formation turned for home. Mission accomplished. Time to get out of there, but they weren't safe yet. German fighters appeared. Messerschmitt Bf-109s. Focke-Wulf FW-190s. Coming in fast. The gunners opened fire. Tracer rounds lit up the sky, and then it happened. The B-17 piloted by McNabb was hit hard. Multiple engine failures. The plane started losing altitude. Losing control. McNabb fought the controls, trying to keep the bomber level, but it was no use. The plane was going down, and it was going down directly on top of Glenn Rojon's lazy-daisy point 20,000 feet in the air. McNabb's crippled B-17 descended right onto Rojon's bomber. There was no time to react. No time to evade. The two 30-ton aircraft collided. Now, here's where things get weird. When two aircraft collide at 20,000 feet, the expected outcome is simple. Destruction. Both planes should have broken apart. Fuel tanks should have ruptured. Explosions should have followed. Both crews should have died instantly, but that's not what happened. Instead, McNabb's B-17 crashed onto the top of Rojon's B-17. And the two planes stuck together. The propellers of McNabb's plane carved into the top of Rojon's bomber, chewing through the fuselage like a buzzsaw. Then they stopped. The engines ceased. And the two aircraft became one. Picture this. Two complete B-17 bombers. One on top of the other. Nose to tail. The belly of McNabb's plane fused to the top of Rojon's plane. 8 engines total. 4 of them are dead. The other 4 are still running. And somehow, incredibly, improbably, the combined aircraft was still flying. Rojon felt the impact. He felt his plane shudder and drop. He looked up and saw the belly of another B-17 filling his windscreen. For a moment, he thought he was dead. But then he realized he wasn't. He was still in his seat. His controls were still responding. His plane was still in the air, sort of. The Lazy Daisy was now carrying the weight of another complete bomber. The wings were bent. The fuselage was crumpling. The controls were heavy and sluggish. But the plane was flying. Against all logic, against all physics, against all reason, it was flying. Rojon's first instinct was to stabilize. He pushed the throttles forward, giving the remaining engines more power. The combined aircraft was descending rapidly, but the descent slowed. He pulled back on the yoke. The nose came up, just a little. He was flying both planes. As one aircraft, let me just pause here to acknowledge how absolutely insane this is. A B-17 was designed to carry a certain weight. It had a specific lift capacity, a specific structural strength. Adding another 30-ton bomber on top of it should have been impossible. The wings should have snapped off. The fuselage should have collapsed. The whole thing should have dropped like a stone, but it didn't. Why? Two reasons. First, the angle of impact. McNab's plane didn't hit Rojon's plane head-on. It came down at an angle, settling onto the top rather than smashing through it. This distributed the force of impact across a wider area. Second, the B-17 was ridiculously over-engineered. The designers at Boeing built this plane to survive punishment that would destroy any other aircraft. They used more rivets than necessary, more aluminum than necessary, more structural supports than necessary. The B-17 could lose engines, lose control surfaces, lose sections of wing, and still fly home. This over-engineering saved Rojon's life. His plane absorbed the impact of the collision. The structure bent but didn't break. The wings flexed but didn't snap. The B-17 did what it was designed to do, keep flying when everything said it should fall, but survival was far from guaranteed. Rojon's intercom was dead. He couldn't communicate with his crew. He had no idea who was alive, who was dead, or who was injured. He couldn't see behind him. He couldn't see above him. All he could do was fly. The back of the plane, chaos reigned. The waist gunners had been thrown around like ragdolls during the collision. The fuselage was torn open in places. Wind screamed through the gaps. One gunner was injured. Another was trying to assess the damage. The radio operator was attempting to restore communications. The flight engineer was checking what systems still functioned. And above them, trapped in the wreckage of McNab's plane, another crew was fighting for survival. McNab's bomber was completely disabled. All four engines were dead. The control surfaces were destroyed. The plane was nothing more than dead weight sitting on top of Rojon's aircraft. But the crew was mostly alive. The tail gunner in McNab's plane was killed in the collision. So was the ball turret gunner. Their positions took the brunt of the impact. But the rest of the crew survived. They were trapped, unable to move, unable to escape, but alive. Now here's the question that must have been going through everyone's mind. How do you get out of this? The answer was complicated. For Rojon's crew, escape meant bailing out. But bailing out required opening hatches, climbing out of the aircraft, and jumping into the void. Not easy when another bomber is sitting on top of you, blocking your exits. For McNab's crew, escape was even harder. Their plane was on top, but it was also completely disabled. They couldn't fly away. They couldn't separate from Rojon's aircraft. And several of their hatches were now blocked by the collision damage. Both crews were trapped, stuck together at 20,000 feet. Descending toward enemy territory, Rojon did the only thing he could do. He kept flying. The combined aircraft was losing altitude steadily. The four working engines simply couldn't produce enough lift to sustain both planes. But Rojon discovered something surprising. He could still control the aircraft. The elevators still worked. The rudder still worked. He could turn. He could climb. He could descend. He was flying a flying fortress. An actual fortress. Two B-17s merged into one hybrid monster aircraft. The formation of other bombers had continued toward England, leaving Rojon behind. No one could help him. No one could do anything. He was on his own. Rojon made a decision. Instead of trying to bail out over Germany, where he and his crew would certainly be captured, he would try to fly toward Allied lines. Maybe, just maybe, he could get close enough to friendly territory that his crew could parachute to safety. He turned the aircraft west. Toward Belgium. Toward France. Toward safety. The next few minutes were a masterclass in aviation skill. Rojon constantly adjusted the throttles, balancing the power between the four working engines. He made tiny corrections with the yoke, fighting the bizarre aerodynamics of his doubled aircraft. He monitored his altitude, watching it slowly decrease. 20,000 feet became 15,000. 15,000 became 10,000. Below him, the landscape changed. German farmland gave way to forests. Forests gave way to the Ardennes. He was getting closer. Meanwhile, the crews were trying to escape. In Rojon's plane, the crew found a way out. The rear hatches were still accessible. One by one, the enlisted men began bailing out. The waist gunners jumped first. Then the radio operator. Then the ball turret gunner, who had climbed out of his cramped station. They fell through the cold air, pulled their rip cords, and watched their parachutes bloom above them. In McNabb's plane, the situation was more desperate. The crew was trying to reach the hatches, but the damage made movement difficult. Some men managed to climb out. Others remained trapped. McNabb himself was still at the controls of his dead aircraft. Not that the controls did anything. His plane was just a passenger now, riding on top of Rojon's bomber. But he stayed at his station, doing what he could to help his crew escape. As the altitude dropped below 5,000 feet, the situation became critical. The combined aircraft was now too low for safe parachute jumps. The remaining crew members had to make a choice: jump now and risk a low-altitude opening, or stay with the planes and face whatever came next. Some jumped. Others stayed. Rojon stayed at the controls. So did his co-pilot, Leek. They were determined to fly this thing as long as possible, giving everyone else the maximum chance to escape. At 3,000 feet, they crossed into Ally-controlled territory. Belgium. They were behind friendly lines. At 2,000 feet, Rojon and Leek finally prepared to abandon ship. They had done everything they could. The remaining crew had either jumped or would have to take their chances. They climbed out of their seats. They moved toward the hatches. And then they jumped. The parachutes opened. They floated down toward the Belgian countryside. Behind them, the conjoined bombers continued their descent. Without a pilot, without control inputs, the combined aircraft began its final dive. It spiraled downward, losing speed, losing altitude, losing the battle against gravity. It crashed in a Belgian field. The impact was surprisingly soft, all things considered. The planes hit at a relatively shallow angle, plowing through the soft earth rather than slamming straight down. Fuel spilled but didn't ignite. The wreckage came to rest in a twisted heap of aluminum and steel. When Belgian civilians reached the crash site, they found something extraordinary. Two complete bombers, still fused together, still recognizable as aircraft. And inside, one more survivor. A crew member who had been unable to bail out had ridden the plane down and survived the crash with minor injuries. In total, 14 of the 20 men on both aircraft survived the collision and its aftermath. Some parachuted to safety. Some survived the crash landing. 6 men died, the tail gunner and ball turret gunner from McNabb's plane, who were killed in the initial collision, and 4 others who couldn't escape in time. Glenn Rojon, the pilot who flew 2 B-17s as one, landed safely by parachute. He was picked up by Allied forces and returned to his base. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions, but here's what really gets me about this story: Rojon didn't think he had done anything special. When asked about the incident later, he was modest. He said he was just doing his job. He was just trying to get his crew home. That mentality was common among the airmen of World War II. They didn't see themselves as heroes. They were just regular guys doing what needed to be done. They faced impossible odds, impossible danger, impossible situations, and they just kept flying. So when 2 bombers collided at 20,000 feet, Glenn Rojon didn't panic. He didn't give up. He assessed the situation, made a plan, and executed it. He flew 2 broken bombers for 30 miles and saved the lives of over a dozen men. That's not just skill. It didn't stay airborne for long. The combined aircraft was descending from the moment of collision. It was never truly flying in the sense of maintaining altitude. It was falling, just slowly enough that Rojon could control the descent, but even a controlled descent shouldn't have been possible. With double the weight and the same wing area, the stall speed of the combined aircraft would have increased dramatically. Rojon should have lost control the moment the planes locked together. Unless the collision actually created additional lift. Here's a theory that aviation experts have proposed. When McNabb's plane settled onto Rojon's plane, it didn't just add weight. It also changed the aerodynamic profile of the combined aircraft. The two fuselages together created a different shape in the airstream. The gap between them might have actually generated some additional lift, similar to how a biplane generates lift from its two wing surfaces. It's not a complete explanation. The physics still don't quite add up. But it might explain why the plane stayed airborne long enough for the crews to escape. Another factor was Rojon's skill at managing the engines. With only 4 of 8 engines working, he had to constantly adjust power to prevent the aircraft from rolling or yawing. A less skilled pilot might have overcorrected and sent both planes into a spin. Rojon's calm, precise inputs kept the aircraft stable, and finally, there was luck. Pure, blind luck. The collision happened at an angle and speed that allowed the planes to lock together rather than tear each other apart. A few degrees different, a few miles per hour faster or slower, and both bombers would have disintegrated. Survival often comes down to luck. But what you do with that luck is up to you. Let me tell you about some of the other insane B-17 survival stories, because this collision wasn't a one-time fluke. The B-17 earned its reputation for durability through countless incidents of impossible damage and improbable survival. There was the all-American B-17 that was nearly cut in half by a collision with a German fighter in 1943. The tail section was hanging on by a few inches of aluminum and the control cables. The pilot, Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg, managed to fly the plane back to base and land it safely. When he taxied to a stop, the tail section fell off. There was Ye Olde Pub, a B-17 that was so badly damaged over Germany that the pilot, Lieutenant Charlie Brown, was struggling to stay conscious. A German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, pulled up alongside the crippled bomber. He could have shot it down easily. Instead, he escorted it toward the English Channel and saluted before turning back. Both pilots survived the war and met decades later, becoming close friends. There was Old 666, a B-17 that was considered so unlucky that no crew wanted to fly it. Lieutenant J. Zima and his crew volunteered to fly this outcast bomber on a dangerous reconnaissance mission. They were attacked by 15 Japanese fighters and fought their way through, shooting down several. Zima and his bombardier both received the Medal of Honor. Every one of these stories has the same theme. The B-17 could take punishment that would destroy any other aircraft, and the crews had the courage to keep fighting when everything seemed lost. But the collision over Germany on December 31, 1944, stands out even among these legendary tales. Flying one damaged B-17 is hard enough. Flying 2 of them fused together is in a category of its own. After the war, Glenn Rojon returned to civilian life. He rarely talked about his experience. Like many veterans, he preferred to leave the war behind him. He raised a family. He had a career. He lived a quiet life, but the story of the collision lived on. Aviation historians documented the incident. Researchers tracked down the survivors and recorded their testimonies. The story appeared in books, magazines, and documentaries about World War II aviation, and today, the wreckage of those 2 bombers still lies in Belgium. Fragments were collected and preserved. Memorials were erected. The Belgian people haven't forgotten the young Americans who fell from their sky on New Year's Eve, 1944. That's what makes World War II history so powerful. These aren't just statistics. They're not just battles and campaigns. They're individual human beings facing unimaginable circumstances and finding ways to survive. 20 men woke up on December 31, 1944, expecting a routine bombing mission. By sunset, 6 of them were dead, and the other 14 had survived one of the most bizarre aerial incidents in history. Their lives changed forever in a matter of seconds, and at the center of it all was a 22-year-old kid from Michigan who refused to give up. That's the first part of this story. But we're not done yet. There's so much more to explore. We need to talk about what happened to the survivors after they landed. We need to talk about how the collision affected the broader mission that day. We need to talk about the German response to this incident. We need to talk about the engineering that made the B-17 so absurdly durable. And we need to talk about what this story tells us about courage, skill, and the human capacity for survival. Want to continue, revise, expand, or change direction? The survivors of the collision had parachuted into Belgium. Allied-controlled Belgium, thankfully. If they had landed just a few miles further east, they would have been in German territory, headed straight for a prisoner of war camp. Instead, they were found by Belgian civilians and Allied soldiers who helped them back to safety. Glenn Rojon landed in a farmer's field. He was shaken but uninjured. His parachute had functioned perfectly, and the Belgian winter had provided a soft landing in snow-covered ground. Within hours, he was at a local aid station, drinking hot coffee and trying to process what had just happened. His co-pilot, William Leake, landed nearby. The navigator, Robert Washington, was recovered a few miles away. One by one, the surviving crew members were found, identified, and transported back toward Allied lines. The scene was chaotic. Remember, this was New Year's Eve. The Battle of the Bulge was still raging just miles away. The Ardennes offensive had caught the Allies off guard, and the region was still contested territory. Belgian villagers were dealing with the uncertainty of war, not knowing if the Germans might return at any moment. Into this chaos dropped a dozen American airmen from two conjoined bombers. The locals did what they could. They provided warm clothes, food, and shelter. They directed the airmen toward Allied military units. Despite the danger to themselves, these Belgian civilians helped every single survivor they found. This is something that often gets overlooked in World War II histories, the incredible bravery of occupied civilians. The Belgians, the French, the Dutch, the Danes, they risked everything to help Allied servicemen. If caught by the Germans, they faced imprisonment, torture, or execution. And they helped anyway. So when Rojon and his crew landed in their country, the Belgians didn't hesitate. They took the Americans in, patched them up, and sent them on their way home. Within 48 hours, Rojon was back at his base in Chelveston, England. He underwent a medical examination. He was interviewed by intelligence officers. He filed his report on the incident. And then, after a brief rest, he was ready to fly again. That's another thing that doesn't get talked about enough. These men didn't get extended leave for trauma. They didn't get months of psychological recovery. If you survived a mission, no matter how terrible, you went back up as soon as you were physically able. The Army Air Forces needed every pilot, every crew, every bomber they could get. The strategic bombing campaign was at a critical phase. German industrial capacity was finally being broken. The Luftwaffe was running out of pilots and fuel. Victory was in sight, but it would only come if the bombing continued. So Rojon climbed back into a B-17 and flew more missions over Germany. He survived the war. He completed his tour of duty. And he went home. But let's talk about what was happening at the crash site while Rojon was recovering. The combined wreckage of the two B-17s drew immediate attention. Belgian farmers who witnessed the crash rushed to the scene. They found a tangle of twisted metal, broken aluminum, and scattered equipment. They also found survivors. At least one crew member rode the planes down and lived. Different sources give different accounts of exactly who survived the crash landing, but the consensus is that at least one man made it through. He was pulled from the wreckage with injuries but alive. The bodies of those who died in the collision were recovered and eventually returned to the United States for burial. These young men, some barely out of their teens, had given everything in the fight against fascism. Allied military investigators arrived at the crash site to examine the wreckage. They documented everything. Photographs were taken. Measurements were recorded. The fused bombers were a unique case, and the engineers wanted to understand exactly what had happened. Their findings confirmed what Rojon had experienced. The two aircraft had become wedged together in such a way that one remained partially controllable. The propellers of McNabb's bomber had chewed into the top of Rojon's fuselage, then seized when they hit structural supports. The two planes became locked together, held in place by the tangled metal. The investigators noted that the collision had occurred at a relatively low closing speed. McNabb's plane was descending onto Rojon's plane, not slamming into it from the side. This vertical collision distributed the impact force more evenly and allowed the planes to mesh rather than shatter. They also noted the incredible structural integrity of the B-17. The wings of Rojon's bomber had bent but not broken. The fuselage had crumpled but maintained enough integrity to hold together. The control cables, miraculously, remained intact. This was Boeing engineering at its finest. The company had designed the B-17 with massive safety margins. Every component was stronger than it strictly needed to be. Every connection was reinforced. Every system had backups. This over-engineering saved lives. Not just in this incident, but throughout the war. B-17s came home with entire sections of wing missing. They came home with their tails hanging by threads. They came home with so many holes in their fuselage that the crew could see daylight through the floor. The nickname, Flying Fortress, was earned, one impossible survival at a time. Now let's zoom out and talk about the broader context of this mission. December 31st, 1944. The final day of a brutal year, the Allies had invaded Normandy just 7 months earlier. D-Day had succeeded, but the fighting since then had been bitter. The hedgerows of Normandy. The breakout at Saint-Lô. The liberation of Paris. The advance across France, and then, just 2 weeks before the collision, came the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last major offensive in the West. A desperate attempt to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. German tanks and infantry smashed through American lines in the Ardennes, creating a massive bulge in the front. The battle was still raging on December 31st. American soldiers were fighting in freezing conditions against a determined enemy. The outcome was still uncertain. In this context, the strategic bombing campaign was more important than ever. Every bomb dropped on German factories was a tank that wouldn't be built. Every railroad yard destroyed was a supply train that wouldn't reach the front. Every synthetic oil plant wrecked was fuel that wouldn't power German vehicles. Hamburg, the target of the mission that led to the collision, was one of the most important industrial centers in Germany. The city had already been devastated by earlier raids, including the infamous firestorm of 1943 that killed tens of thousands. But German industry was resilient, and factories were rebuilt or relocated. The bombers had to keep coming back. So on New Year's Eve, over 1,000 heavy bombers headed for targets across Germany. The collision between Rojon's and McNab's planes was just one incident in a massive operation involving tens of thousands of airmen. Other planes were lost that day, too. Shot down by flak. Destroyed by fighters. Crashed on landing. The loss rate was lower than it had been earlier in the war, thanks to the P-51 Mustang escorts that now accompanied the bombers all the way to the target and back. But losses still occurred. Men still died. That's the context of this story. One incredible incident in a war full of incredible incidents. One group of survivors in a conflict that killed millions. Now let's talk about the German perspective. The Luftwaffe in late 1944 was a shadow of its former self. The great air battles of 1943 had bled the German fighter force white. Experienced pilots were dead. Fuel was scarce. New pilots were thrown into combat with minimal training and died quickly. The fighters that attacked the bomber formation on December 31st were among the last remnants of German air power. They were brave men flying in a losing cause. They knew the war was lost. They knew they were unlikely to survive. But they attacked anyway. When McNab's plane was hit and started going down, it might have been struck by flak or by fighter cannon fire. The historical record isn't entirely clear on what disabled his engines. But German forces were responsible. One way or another, the Germans would have watched the collision happen. Imagine being a Luftwaffe pilot, turning away after your attack run, and glancing back to see 2 American bombers locked together, still flying. It must have seemed surreal. German troops on the ground also witnessed the descent of the combined aircraft. As the planes passed over contested territory, soldiers looked up at this bizarre apparition in the sky. 2 bombers fused together, descending slowly, crossing the lines toward Allied territory. Some might have taken shots at it. A slow-moving, low-flying target would be tempting. But by that point, the planes were already committed to their crash landing. Nothing could change their fate. After the crash, German intelligence likely learned about the incident through reconnaissance or intercepted communications. But by late 1944, the Germans had bigger problems than one unusual aircraft collision. They were fighting for survival on 2 fronts. The Russians were closing in from the east. The Western Allies were pushing from the west. The Reich was crumbling. So the collision became just another footnote in the endless chaos of the war's final months, but for the men involved.